This is the screencast for Lesson 35 in Stephen's C# 24-hour trainer. This lesson is about building simple database applications using data sets. So that's what we're going to do for this Try It. So I'm going to create a new application from scratch. I'm going to call it Contacts Grid. And I'm going to set the form's title to Contacts Grid. I like to do that so if you see a picture of this program, you'll be able to figure out which one it is. The first step in making this kind of application is to go to the Data menu. We'll pick Add New Data Source. We're going to be working from a database. We're also going to use a data set. Entity data models are a little more recent. We'll get to that in a later lesson. They let the program manipulate objects in the database as if they were objects inside the program. For now, we're going to stick with a data set, however. I don't want to use this database connection. This is one I used for a SQL Server Express Edition example. So I'm going to, and if I look in the list, here are other database connections I've made in the past. There's another SQL Server example. There's an Access example. I don't want any of those, so I'm going to click New Connection. I'm going to use a Microsoft Access database file. If you needed to change it, you click the Change button, and it would let you pick whatever kind of database you're using. Let's find the database. This is the one I'm going to use, the contacts.mdb database. It's available in this lesson's download. I'll click Open. If I wanted to, I could click Test Connection. I may as well do it. And it says Test Connection Succeeded. That's good. I'll click OK to finish creating that connection. So there it is in our list, in the list of connections. I'm going to click Next. Now it's saying the selected connection uses a local data file. Do I want to copy it into the project? If you want to distribute the application with the database, that's often a good idea. It makes it easier to keep the database together with the project, so I'll just say yes. Do I want to save the connect string? Sure, I'll let it do that. And now it's looked at the database and it's figured out what is in there. Right now it knows there's, in the tables, there's a contacts table that has these fields. I want to collect, I'm going to take that table in my data set. If there was more than one table in this data set, you could select more than one. Sorry, if there was more than one table in this database, you could put more than one table in the data set. You can also select specific fields if you want. I'm just going to take all of them. And then I'll click Finish. So at this point, Visual Studio is building all those objects described in the text to manipulate this, to manage this stuff. Now I need to find the data source that I just created. And the data sources menu window isn't here yet, so I'm going to go up to the Data menu again and select Show Data Sources. Here's our Data Sources window. I'm going to lock it down there so it doesn't hide from us, and I'm going to drag it over here so it doesn't take up extra space. If I expand this, here's the contacts data set. It contains the contacts table, and here are all the fields. For this example, we're going to make the grid-like display, so I'm going to grab this table and drag it onto the form. You can see that the cursor has a little plus sign to let me know that I can drop here. When I do the drop, here's all these user interface objects. This is the data grid view control. I'm going to go over here to the properties window and I'm going to dock it so it fills the form. So I'll change dock to fill. And you notice that right away it's already displaying the columns in this table. And there isn't room on the form for all of them, so I'm just going to enlarge the form until there is, until everything fits. Phone, cell, email, that's the last field. Make it just a little bit bigger than that. So there's our form. This thing up here has all the controls we need to manipulate the data. Here are the various components that the thing built. Let me get rid of some of this so you can see the form better. Down here are the various components that Visual Studio built to allow us to control the data set better. Looks like they've kind of landed on top of each other. So if we run the application now, this thing is almost fully functional. Sorry this doesn't fit on the screencast, but the fields off the edge here are just cell and email. So if you click on a cell, we can change this. We'll change Charles's name to Chuck. We can change values in these pretty much freely. Here, we'll change that to Arizona. Chuck doesn't know he's moving, but he is. This last row in the data grid view has a star in it. If you start typing there, it automatically creates a new record. Oh, in this case, what happened was I typed Mike and then I tried to click off of this record, and it's complaining because column last name does not allow nulls. I need to enter a value in that column before I can go off of this row. So let me try again. Let me say Mike, and this time I'm going to use the arrow key to stay in this row without leaving the row before I finish in here. Mike Mischief, somewhere, New York, New York. I'm going to fill all the fields in because I don't remember which ones are required. Probably these are not, but and you'll notice that it doesn't do any error checking. You can add that to the program. It's a slightly more advanced technique, so I'm not going to cover it right now. So for instance, I can enter gibberish for the phone number of the cell phone and for the email address, which is off the screen here. So now that I've finished entering all the fields, I can move off of this record, and that record is part of the data set. I'm going to close that. Now if I run the program again, you'll see that Mike Mischief has not been added. We never saved the changes. If I clicked this little Save Data button, the pre-built controls would save the data for me with no questions asked. So that's easy enough. But what happens if the user tries to close the form like I just did and forgot to save changes? Well, let's click on the form and give it the form closing event handler. So I'll go over here to the events page, find the form closing event handler. You may not recall from way back in the early lessons, form closed occurs just before the form closes. Form closing is just before form closed. It's the last point where you can cancel the close. So here we're going to ask the user if we should really want to close or not. Form closing is where we need to do that if we want to have any hope of saving the user. So in the form closing event here, I'm going to ask the user, should I close or not? I'm going to let the user have three choices, yes, no, and cancel. So I can't use a simple if, then, else statement here because I want to take three different possible actions. So what I'm going to do is display this dialog and then save the result in a variable so I can look at it. So I'm going to say dialog result, I'll call it result, equals messagebox.show. I'm just going to say save changes. I also need to, I'm going to use a different overload of this. I'm going to use, let's find the version I'm going to use. This version, you can't see all of it, but it takes a text, caption, the buttons, and an icon that I want to use. So text is save changes. I'm going to make the caption save changes also. The buttons I'm going to use, I'm going to say yes, no, cancel. And then for an icon, I'm going to use the question mark icon. So that statement will display the message box and save the result in this result variable. Now I'm going to check the result. So if result equals dialog result dot yes, well, let's start with cancel because that's easy. Start with the easy one first. Then what I want to do is cancel the form closing. So I ask, do you want to save your changes? The user presses cancel. We no longer close the form. So we'll just set e.cancel to true. That's all we need to do. So that'll tell the form closing event system, don't close the form. All right, else if result equals, let's do yes this time. This says the user, I asked the user to save changes. The user said yes. So we need to save the changes. How do we do that? Well, there are a bunch of objects floating around that were created by Visual Studio that could do that. Probably the best place, the most appropriate place to do that is with the table adapter. So if I find the contacts table adapter, and I'll call its update method. The adapters, data adapters are designed to move data to and from a database. This table adapter is in particular designed to move data between this particular database and the contacts table in the data set. So as a parameter, I need to pass it what I want to update. I'm going to pass the entire data set to it. So it'll update the data set to the best of its abilities. And then finally, there's a chance that that will fail. That could fail, for example, if the user entered values that fail the database's validations. For instance, if there's an age field in the database that is a number, and this grid contains text. As you saw when I did the example a minute ago, the grid itself doesn't do any validation right now. So the update might fail. If it does fail, then we don't want to save the data. We want to bail out, let the user figure out what's going on. So just to be extra safe here, let's put this in a try block. Let's catch the exception so we can tell the user if there's a problem. And we'll put that update statement inside the try block, and then we'll just say messagebox.show and display whatever the exception says is wrong. So now if the database has a problem with the data, hopefully the user can fix it. But if that happens, we also don't want to close the form so the user has a chance to fix it before exiting. So right inside, right here, I'm going to just check and see, was the data successfully saved? If it wasn't, I'm going to cancel. So I'm going to say e.cancel equals contacts dataset dot has changes. So if we still have changes, that means they were not saved, so we should cancel. All right, so up here we checked for the user click the cancel button, the user click the yes button. There's one more option, that's if the user clicks the no button. So if we ask the user to save changes, the user says no, then we just keep going. The user doesn't want to save the changes, so we don't need to do anything special, and we don't need to set e.cancel to true. So do nothing here. All right, now let's run the program. And let's create Mike Mischief again and see what happens. Oops. Let me make the form big enough so you can see it. Okay, there's Mike. And Mike Mischief. And I'm going to try to leave this row and see if any of the other fields are required. They're not. That's all we needed to add. Now I'm going to exit the program, and it says save changes. I'm going to say cancel. That's good. It did not close the form. Let me try again. I'll close the program, save changes. This time I'll say yes. Now let's run the program again and see if Mike is in there. There's Mike at the bottom. This is not a very fancy program. There's lots of typical things that you might want to do, like filter for data, search for people from a particular state or whatever. I'll show you a little bit about how to do that in the next lesson. But in general, these sorts of programs that are built by drag and drop are very primitive. They're great if you need to look at, say, your customer database and make a few changes. They're not so great if you're going to sell this to customers or distribute this widely to people who aren't quite as savvy, and they might be putting in a lot of invalid data here and there. Save changes, no.